Hello, this is Susan Bird, and you are listening to the Curated Conversations podcasts. In this series, East meets West and vice versa, we're exploring the new conversations taking place in and between Asia and the West on a variety of subjects. With me today is Chiu Ti, an amazing woman I met here in New York when she was interviewing a senior American business executive regarding financial and economic issues important to both China and the United States. I was so impressed with her professionalism and intellect. I made a point of our connecting since then, and I'm delighted she agreed to join us for this conversation and share her views regarding Asia and the West. Chiu Ti was born in Taiwan of Chinese parents who escaped the revolution, and thanks to her father, who was determined that his children would receive the best education possible, Chiu Ti's undergrad degree from National Taiwan University was just the beginning of her senior academic career. She came to the United States and received a master's in comparative literature at the University of Michigan, then was a PhD candidate at Yale University in literature and art history, and then, since that wasn't enough, received a degree in law from Columbia University Law School. She has practiced law at top-tier firms in the United States, has worked in the investment banking business, and among other things, formed a company called China Happenings, a multimedia platform that focuses on lifestyle and cultural industries of contemporary China. Her narrative is so unusual that Chiu Ti was encouraged to capture it in a memoir that is coming out soon in China. So she'll be a celebrity, certainly there for sure, and we're sure after that the rest of the world. Chiu Ti speaks Mandarin, English, conversational French. She says basic German and fair Japanese. So welcome to Curated Conversations, Chiu Ti.
Thank you, Susan, for having me.
So when we talk about the conversations taking place in and between Asia and the West, what does that bring to mind for you?
I felt there was not a real conversation. Rather, there are a lot of crisscrossed monologues. And therefore, I think conversation is particularly needed, meaning real emotional exchanges. When you talk about dialogues, first thing that came to my mind would be like biannual dialogue between the U.S. and Chinese governments. They are very formal, full of political posturing, but I felt there are more needed conversations on an individual basis, on more friendly terms, to encourage people to really have a very easygoing, relaxed, exchange.
Has the dialogue shifted over the past decade? Have you seen?
Not much, surprisingly. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, I started connecting myself with Jared Kushner's New York Observer. At the time, they started a new magazine called NYO Magazine. It was before we actually formed a joint venture to publish a bilingual magazine called Yue Magazine. In my first installment of my sort of a column called China Happenings for the magazine, I was actually talking about the contemporary Chinese art scene and using it as a sort of a window to look at what's transforming China today. When the article was published, it was alarming to me that the editor, without consulting me, had changed the title to East meets West. And I have to confess to you that it's a very hackneyed title. And if you know me enough, I hate to do anything that's, trite or hackneyed. Especially, I try to pick up a very unique angle, a small thing to decide, a nuanced discussion. And that's what I also think a real conversation should be nuanced, not always such a big sweep. In other words, when I speak to you or speak with you, it doesn't have to be a dialogue between China and the USA. We are just two persons. So, but that incident taught me about the vocabulary that we have today, at least in this part of the world, has not really made much progress since 1889 that Kipling, published his famous poems, East is West, and East is East, West is West, and the two trains never met, And I think that concept sort of grows on us, and then we have never been able to transcend that. Yeah.
You have such a remarkable story on a lot of levels, and I'm fascinated by the one that you started to tell me about your family heritage in China. Mm-hmm. I know you recently learned that your family, when they left for Taiwan, left behind an amazing, extraordinary heritage home of about 250,000 square feet. Somehow it had escaped destruction, and you and your brother recently held a banquet there for, 900 of your relatives who are still living there. Mm-hmm. Tell us that story, and the fact that you didn't know about it for so long. That's fascinating.
I have to give you a little bit of the background. My father left China in 1947, 2 years before the communist takeover of China. Then subsequently, he married a Taiwanese woman, my mother. My mother was born and raised in Taiwan. So in Taiwan, there's a special term for this type of kids, that we are like a melange, a mixture of yam or sweet potato and taro. Both are similar, but they are both root vegetables, but they are distinct. So I'm born as a mixture, so to speak. And I grew up with my father, knowing my father as an education freak. So if you look at my educational background, you may feel, oh, it's impressive enough. But I could go on and tell you that my brother has a PhD from Harvard in, math. My sister has a PhD in chemistry from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So long story short, all of my siblings, or both of my siblings and I married someone who has a PhD from a high, education institution in the U.S. But while we grew up in foreign countries. So I had a very ambivalent feeling about that upbringing, because my father was really a tiger dad, so to speak. All the disciplines and the sense of purposefulness that I have inherited from him or grew up with it. So by the time that I studied in the U.S., I had a little bit of a very westernized outlook, so to speak. So one time my mother visited me at Yale, and she brought a collection of poems published by one of my distant relatives who already passed away. So at the time, I really laughed. I said, my world, was full of Shakespeare, Spencer. How would I bother to read a country, scholar's poems and read it in Chinese? Okay, so you can really imagine the relationship I had with my father, and something old that I left behind. So after my father passed away in 2009, I promised my mother to go with her to go back to visit my hometown. And really, at that time, I didn't know anything about, what's there.
You had never been there?
No. And my father only mentioned some sort of small facts, but never told me the story about the home. And not to say, the home is like now the largest residential compound in the entire China. I'm not talking about in that province, but the entire China. So just before I was leaving for China, one Saturday in my New York apartment, I started looking for sort of some information about my hometown. So after hours of research, I chanced upon a blogger who wrote about his visit to this, impressive compound, and it's the massive, with close to 900, relatives, by the last name Liu, which was my maiden name, still live in the compound. and I had no idea if it's my hometown. So I called my mother, after the difference of time being accounted for. My mother had no idea. Then I kept on reading more at the blog, and it had more than 50 pictures. I suddenly chanced upon a picture of a few headshots. It's a scene from the compound of the ancestral home, saying that these are the overseas students from the family. So I saw a picture which looked like my sister, and then another picture looked like my brother. Then I saw my own picture. That was when I graduated from Columbia. I cried because I suddenly realized my father did that for us. The reason why we wanted to go back and host a banquet was we were inducted, so to speak, to the ancestral home. We had a place in the ancestral home. So that was something that's really just something. And then my father never really told me so much about it. And long story short, it's not only that the size of the home, but rather the family story, how the house was founded. It has more than 262 years of history, built under the Qianlong Emperor reign. But not only that, since the founding of that branch of the family with this house, there has been a common property. It's a paddy, a rice paddy. The income generated from the rice paddy will be used as scholarship to support the family members, the kids who are good at school. So I suddenly realized that's where I came from. My education freak father, the whole value system. But obviously, the reason why this is a particular interesting story is if you look at the contemporary Chinese society, your father may be a butcher, your father may be a tycoon. They all want their kids to go to Beijing University, to go to Tsinghua, to go to Harvard. So I think it's a window to really understand what's still going on. I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago when China, the college entrance examinations result have come out, you can really see each province has their own number one student, okay, the one who hit the highest score. The way they celebrated the success of this number one, the ceremonial nature of it, if you look at it, it's right out of 200 or 300, 500, 1,000 years ago. It's the same ceremony, the way they dress up, etc. So it's very interesting, that part. Given today, the hierarchy of the social status of different professions have already changed. It used to be scholars was the number one, the businessman was the bottom one. We call it the scholars, and then the farmers, and the workers, and then the lowest tier, it used to be the businessman. Now the businessman has been, as a category, has been selected as the idols of the younger generation. But then you still have this twist of, emphasizing that scholarly cultural, or value.
Well, that brings up a couple of things. One is this focus on education, and much of it is that a lot of people want their kids to go to school in the West because they admire that approach to education, which you've, of course, experienced. And I'm very interested in it because whenever I talk to people in China about Chinese schools, they point out that it still is very much a pattern of rote learning. It's to pass exams. And for that reason, since it hasn't changed much, is that they are interested in this kind of critical thinking that they think comes about when you question authority and actually put yourself in a mode of what if, as opposed to here are the things you need to know and just memorize them. I'm fascinated by that because if we think that the kind of critical thinking that is taught at schools in the West primarily, although it's being taught more and more in parts of Asia and certainly China too, if we think that's where innovation comes from, and that the secret to China's future is going to be innovation, if that's the case, and I'd be curious as to what you think, then where does it come from? Is the educational system going to shift? Or are there going to be more and more kids who get educated in the West and then they come here and they influence the way people think and the way they approach problems?
I think it will come from both. First of all, this is a complex subject which I dealt with in my memoir or book. The reason being that I actually came from an educational background which was even more traditional than the current Chinese society. I come from Taiwan. Most of Chinese know that even in Taiwan, we had, the way I was brought up, we had an even more traditional Chinese upbringing than currently practiced in China. Here they use, in China, they use simplified characters. We still use traditional characters.
Oh,
okay. And then when I grew up, I memorized thousands of poems. Okay. So the question is, I asked that question, whether this rote memory, process make you stupid or make you smart. And I think it really depends on disciplines. Recently, there's also an interesting survey about the kids who succeeded in China's college exam, entrance exams, like a top 1 or 2 and 3. Where did they end up? Where they ended up, whether it was an indicator, how successful they were in life. And I think it's very consistent with my own observation. It really depends on which disciplines. Like me, for example, the way I approach my even current entrepreneurship, it has a lot of cultural underpinnings to it. Okay, if you are talking about liberal arts, etc., those analyticals, to have those rote learnings, it gives you a very solid base, that you will not have. And therefore, a lot of people ask me, why did you pick the road now you are choosing rather than, a high-paid job as a lawyer? Because I could tell many people for a fact that very few people who will have the same degree of knowledge or immersion in the Western culture, but then still with the same learning about the traditional Chinese cultures. Meaning I could read ancient texts back to 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Very few Chinese today could actually do that. So I take it as my mission, because I know this generation, they won't have the luxury, no one will force them, to do that in their childhood, and
so this is fascinating. And I'm especially interested because if the current millennials in China are people for whom that book becomes fascinating reading, that could have a major impact, because when you think about the fact that anybody born in China in the last 30 years has seen nothing but this new China with exponential growth, up until very recently when there's been this slowdown economically. And that means that they have, for the most part, been brought up in a totally different world than the ones in which their parents worked and toiled in many cases. So the underground underpinnings that might have been apparent in other cultures where it hasn't been so disruptive and so exponentially different are absent. So it could be that you help them form the very foundation that some of them seem to have an appetite for or are hungry for. Is that wishful thinking on my part, or is that part of
that's definitely the hope. But I also cautioned that the objective that I was trying to accomplish in writing this book is not to impose my own sense of value. I hope to give them a framework that they could examine their own options. For example, the other part of the coin, side of the coin, is if they are into science, into engineering, or even, with genome decoding, they might be a different educational background, which is, sort of more conducive to that type of learning. And one has to learn which is the part that fits you. And I think the problem is the younger generation, on the one hand, they have many more choices, or they are born into a more privileged background. And they were encouraged from day one to start their own company, so to speak. On the other hand, I also can be sympathetic to the fact that they were born as a one-child emperor, On the other hand, they turn around, they found out they are just one dime in a dozen. And that's a very typical situation now in China, that in the past few years, actually the education institutions have already increased in number exponentially. But the competition is also getting tougher. They produce more graduates, so the job market is relatively more difficult. So I think a lot of Chinese, the younger generations, they have to figure out, because no one is, can tell them for a fact that the value system one way will lead to another. So they have to determine. And then after all, if everybody is trying to is into big data, everybody is trying to write their own app, killer application. At one point, there's nothing, because everybody is doing the same thing. Everybody is talking about O2O, office to office services. So they have to figure out what's the best for them, and to figure out how to get the best from the different, educational systems.
Well, this is a really fascinating issue, and is a crucially important one, because because of the size of China and the number of young people we're talking about, and the opportunities, and yet the challenges that they face. I'm sure that this slowing down of the economy has some of them worried. I mean, they probably think, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't continue to grow this much, and now I have competition and a lot of it, and how am I going to place myself in there? I'm fascinated by this interest you have in the connection between the intellectual and the commercial. For example, fashion. I know, when I met you, that you had a very unusual outfit on, and you said every one of my outfits tells a story. So narrative seems to wend its way through everything you're up to. Tell me about this connection between the intellectual and the commercial, and how that plays out in the fashion area.
I came from a very intellectual background. In my book, I talked about when I grew up, I never had a doll. My father bought me a complete set of Holmes, the detective stories, when I was 6. So I grew up reading a lot of detective stories.
Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes. And then after I was in my primary school, my father bought a whole complete set of all the Nobel-winning literatures. So you can really see I come from that kind of very scholarly background, and so with that kind of intellectual underpinnings, I wanted to do something which has real impact. But I realized fast enough that once I got into the media world, it's all commerce, especially we are in a sort of radically transforming industry, right? It used to be that journalism is respected for the integrity and professionalism. But left and right, now a lot of journalistic or media enterprises, they are basically have to leash on to another businesses. And in other words, media is just a tool. It itself is not self-sufficient. Give you an example. A few years ago, when I started writing again after I quit law practicing, the money I got as a writer was the same as when I wrote at 11 years old in Taiwan for newspaper. I already started, I was a very precocious writer. That just tells you people are not paying for quality writing, period. That's the truth. With that, you have a lot of consequences, and so I'm very cognizant about how, if I need to get my words out, I need to make it work as a business model. So fashion-wise, it's almost like an intuition, because I'm a little bit of an art animal in the sense that when I was a lawyer, I really dressed the part. But I always knew that I have this I have an eye for fashion. So after I quit practicing law, I feel like I wanted to be myself for one day. And with time, the way I dressed myself started getting attention. So I got into a lot of red carpet, etc. And then with that, people started to be curious about what I wear, especially not sponsored by commercial interests, which is very rare because in today's world, people typically have, a brand or, or they have someone bankrolled their outfits.
And often not really representative of who they are.
Yeah, it's not about style. For example, the dress that you saw me is by a Greek designer, Mary Kataranzu. She's based in London. She's known for using digital prints. And I wore that dress, I put it on just right before the event because I suddenly realized that it's a smart play on pinstripes. Because underneath this very flowery pattern, ornate jewelry pattern, below it, it's this very pronounced pinstripe. And remember, I came from Wall Street. Wearing pinstripe is a statement of power. Coincidentally, Mr. Wilbur Ross also wore a pinstripe suit that day. So it was bingo. So in my book, I talked about, for me, dressing or wearing something, it shows one's taste or style, which is, again, are not popular terms in today's vernacular because people just want to get attention. But I thought, it's important to have a sense of style, and sometimes you may be able to tell a story very indirectly because people are always visual.
I love that. Mm-hmm. So does that, let's go back to the young people that you'll be addressing. How much do you know about young people and the way they're thinking in China now, their willingness to speak up to authority and ask questions? When we were talking before about the educational system and the developing critical thinking. Is that developing on its own? Are people speaking up about stuff? My sense is that the government has paid some real attention and is doing something in the area of pollution, for example, and I'm wondering if that's partly because people have really been speaking up about it. It's a pretty transparent world. You can take pictures of stuff.
Yeah, I think gradually, last year, a friend of mine actually did a sort of a charitable project that they doing a video consisting of a sort of a famous pop singer, and they sing about the pollution, but make it in almost a funny way, so hip hop way. And so I think there are many different projects that I think people learn how to use social media and different ways to express themselves. Although sometimes I want to caution because China's social media really becomes its own animal. It's in a proportion that we can hardly imagine in the West. I would say in China, the way they process information, the way the social media works and how they connect, or even the transmission of like a TV or movie projects, they are already going to a different world because they directly leapfrog, to a different stage. And now it's getting in a way that it's a very complex, and in a way it also creates a sense of, how do you say, opposite result. I think in the past, people wanted to have a soapbox on which they could articulate their opinion. Now, I think in a way, people find out when everyone is standing on a soapbox, nobody's getting heard, right? Because it's just a cacophony. Let me give you another example. Recently, I chanced upon a news article about a very prominent Chinese movie star. Has already transformed herself into a producer and a film director. Very, very well respected. I don't know if it's by her own efforts or because of her marriage. She's, pinned on as one of the richest, couple or women in China. I think she's definitely billionaire over, along with her husband's assets. So long story short, in that context, readers start to discover that a lot of internet portals or internet economic commerce players, because of the sheer power of their influences and also the channels they have to distribute their very varied products, they actually could use their commercial powers to basically censor contents. Okay, so now finally people are getting it, because operating in the Western world, I'm always cognizant. Today, it's not whatever I write, I just go out and write. I have to find a way to distribute my ideas to make that an effective exercise. So in that process, I have to encounter, of course, commercial interest. I may not encounter government-sponsored, censorship, but I have to deal with from a commercial front. So now China, a lot of web, we call it denizens, they start to face that, sense that issue. So again, what I'm just trying to say is there are a lot of complexities in various phenomena, and one needs to dig further to really understand, a lot of nuances. Yeah.
So with this cacophony, with all this noise out there, which is true in the Western world as well, what is the answer? Are young people are they figuring this out and gravitating towards another way to express themselves, or are we still at the stage of everybody's just getting overwhelmed by all this stuff?
I think they are trying to figure out a way, and whether to have a more trustworthy gatekeepers of information. I don't think you could superimpose from the top, but whether they could develop from their own. But a lot of younger, more sort of up-and-coming or intelligent millennials, I sense that they started to feel the need, because it's not that easy. I have seen many people who had gone through their own startups and who were disillusioned. They thought the world was their oyster, but they realized that they need some actual experiences and, to gain some solid experiences or education.
So what about the increased pressure regarding privacy? Because that has a play in here. Not necessarily censorship, but in the West, we're so obsessed with people finding out information about us, and we try to protect our personal data and so on. Is that as much an issue in China as it is here?
Yeah, but there's an irony, right? Because look at everyone trying to exhibit himself through social media, right?
It's insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this whole question about asking for privacy while simultaneously need to expose themselves, I think it's a very, very complex process, because as I told you, today, because a lot of Chinese, we use WeChat. It's one of the very powerful messaging platforms coming out of China. And in many sense, I think it's more powerful than, the Western equivalent. And then within that application, you have a friends circles. You could post something that your friends will all know about it. So it's a more defined circles than Facebook, like public facing. It's like an inner circles. And I have friends who just 24 hours, they were posting their own pictures in all possible embarrassing, situation. But I don't think they post it because it's embarrassing to make fun of themselves. They really thought it's flattering. So I think this sense of, transgression, self-transgressed boundary that lost between the outside and inside, it's particularly interesting. And therefore, I think it's if you look at what the younger generation now are moving towards, the VR, because in a sense, they are living in a virtual reality world. Even if it's real, they treat it as if it's unreal, right? If it's unreal, then it doesn't have this stigma. They don't feel they are overexposing themselves.
Well, Pokemon Go, that current fad is a good example of that, this mixture of augmented or virtual reality and the real thing. I think it's going to be interesting. I'm especially curious when we talk about, and I'm fascinated by what you said about East meets West, because I did think that it was the fact that it has been so hackneyed that it was sort of fascinating to me, because I think they never have truly met. The twain hasn't really met yet, as you said. But I'm interested that more and more the idea of geographical boundaries seems to be not so important, because many people feel that they are global citizens. And it's those who learn that, in fact, there is a whole world of people that are in communication with each other, even if they have met, maybe never physically, but that they have this connection with each other, that will have real impact on the opportunities for us to communicate more effectively with other parts of the world, especially between these two parts, which are both superpowers in their own way. So I'm going to assume, especially because of this book that's coming out, that you have a real sense of optimism about China's future. So what's the biggest source of your optimism?
I think China has the brain power behind it. Once it figures out that everything is like a double-edged sword. For example, if you look at the Olympics, it's a game, it's like an ocean of people. That's what Zhang Yimou was good at, right? You cannot compete anything, but if you have a massive dance by this huge number of people. And I think this is a wonderful metaphor, because Chinese are keenly aware of the fact that this is their core strength. That's why they become the world's factory, right? But now, that's also the biggest challenge, because you have so many people. You always pour down the number, right? You always have a bigger denominator, right? It dilutes the effect of your growth. China is as big in terms of geographical size as the United States or Europe. And inside, even though China, since the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, we already had a very unified written language. And now we have a unified spoken language, official language. But still, region-wise, they varied a lot. And so, whatever you think, if you look at the number, the GDP is still not as high. But then that also means that if you look at the pockets of wealth, you have enough of consumers of luxury goods. So whenever you want to look at it into China, you always have to look at this true China's, phenomena. It's like you really have these two worlds. So in terms of business opportunities, it's still big enough, even though not, on average level, you don't have the same kind of income level yet. But if you look at the pockets, the number of people, enough to consume certain products, you are definitely there. And in terms of the receptiveness of digital, equipments or cultures, they are definitely ahead of us. So because they skip, it's just by definition, they skip one step.
They were able to leapfrog.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
But wasn't there before, they just jumped over it.
Mm-hmm.
So I get your optimism. So what will the biggest challenges be? One is, you said, just the sheer numbers of people.
Yeah, I think, are you asking about internally or to deal with the West?
I'm asking internal, how China, its future, forgetting the West for the moment, just how it will fare, what its biggest challenges will be.
I think there are two fronts. One is there are always competing needs, right? Because it's not that Chinese society or the Chinese government are not for reform or modernize for example, the financial system, but there are different parts of the societies that they also have to account for. So which one will take the priority? On the other hand, I also think that it goes back to the sort of beginning of our conversation. I think China is really open to have a conversation with the rest of the world. But there are always going to be this noise or challenges because the West will always want to talk about human rights and environmental violations, etc. And China would like to have maybe a different ways of engage in that conversations, not feeling always being, scolded for not being the West. And I think that's the tough part because if you look at a lot of even recent territorial dispute about the Southern Sea, you will see the Chinese, the people who live in China, they obviously have a different perspective, independently of the government from what the people in the West would have. So how to have that interesting dialogue or conversation going on? Or, another example is, if you read about the Economist's recent report about China or other reports about China, it's always very interesting to me that they will highlight certain facts. But the question, for example, one thing they talked about was there were some nationalistic sentiments in China, particularly in their reportage about the West. But just based on my reading of the Chinese news, in China, sometimes, of course, they will also have some Western bashing language. On the other hand, there's enough countervailing import of American pop cultures or movies, etc. So at least they know both worlds. They will not imagine the West as being poor or ill-educated, right? So the problem now we have to have a real conversation, and that's what I hope I will be able to contribute to that conversation, is in the West, we tend to only have one side. It's not like, whatever we said about China is all false, but rather because we so focus on one side of the issues or the phenomena, we often forget that we don't have, how many people here actually watch Chinese, movies, television, right? While the Chinese, they all know about Sex and the City, Gossip Girl. So what I'm saying is that we have a very imbalanced situation, the knowledge base. When Steve Schwarzman set up a scholarship at the Beijing University about a few years ago, it's his version of Rhodes Scholars. Okay, he had the Schwarzman Scholars. He said for every 8 Chinese students studying in the U.S., we only have one American students in China. So I still think there's an imbalanced, flow of information and interest. And therefore, I hope with time that will change, and therefore the conversation will be more free flowing and less sort of always been like pitting Chinese view against the Western view.
Well, I think I feel the same way. So I'm hoping that these curated conversations may play some role in that. Are there any other issues that you'd like to mention regarding this whole East-West phenomenon, something that you think is important that we haven't touched on?
No, I just wanted to mention, because this is the area that's dear to my mind, that in the past 2 years, Chinese investors or strategic or financial investors have really, sort of broken into Hollywood. The reason why this is important is when commerce start to impact the cultural productions, you will start to have its own snowballing effect. This year, Warcraft didn't garner very high box office opening in the States, but it was a very strong run from the beginning and in China. So what I have always been very interested in is how economy later impacts, if not dictates, the cultural taste. So I think now there are more and more collaborative models between China and the West, or even Chinese with Korean cultural industries. But as they currently collaborate, they still bifurcate it, or they divide the market. They are not made, for example, they collaborate on a film project, but it's meant for the Chinese audience because they still have a different sense of aesthetics or narrative styles. with time, we are going to see more and more interesting interactions. And that in itself is very fascinating to me.
Oh, it is to me as well. That's great. Well, thank you, Chiu Ti. It's been a delight to share your perspectives. Chiu Ti is really a remarkable person who was born in Taiwan of Chinese parents, and thanks to her father and their emphasis on education has received a really remarkable one. She got her undergraduate degree from National Taiwan University, and then here in the States received a master's in comparative literature at the University of Michigan, was a PhD candidate at Yale in literature and art history, and then received a law degree from Columbia University Law School. She's practiced law and has worked in investment banking and advising on mergers and acquisitions. She formed her own company called China Happenings, which is a multimedia platform that focuses on lifestyle and cultural industries of contemporary China. Her narrative is so unusual that she's been encouraged to capture it in a memoir, which will be coming out soon in Chinese. We'll have to wait here in the West for it to be in English, but I have a feeling that won't take a long time. Chiu Ti speaks Mandarin, English, conversational French, basic German, fair Japanese. She can talk to just about everybody. So thanks so much, Chiu Ti. This is Susan Bird.